Right. Thanks a lot for everyone for joining us today for the session. We are really excited to see a lot of familiar faces and names in the attendee list and also some new faces. So it's really great to see so many participants. So for the people who do not know much about Xeno or the kind of work that we do, I would like to just begin with a very brief introduction about what we do and the kind of work that we do. So Xeno is a service design and social innovation consultancy. We are based primarily in India. We have our majority of the team members in India, but at the same time, we have a very wide network across the globe who help us execute projects in different markets. So we work mainly towards an impact-driven application of human-centered design to solve real-world challenges. So over the past few years, our team has gained understanding and over like the relationship between the socio-cultural context of diverse user segments of India and how does that affect the way they interact and use digital products and services, which is what we want to talk about today as well. So over the years, it's been very evident for us that the way users interact is not, or the behave is not limited only to the functional use of those products, but also it transcends into how does it affect the digital privacy. So today we are going to talk about some of our very recent learnings and understandings. We have tried to articulate some of the learnings that we have around how does this socio-cultural context transcends into digital context. And we also understand that a lot of people in the audience are not from India or do not know exactly the Indian context. So we have tried our best to include as much as possible from the context and the background perspective, so all of us are on the same page. So before taking more time, sorry. So how the session will go is that first 30 minutes, I let Avni take the lead and then present our learnings, who is also our research lead, who has had experience in designing and developing digital products, and also has been an integral part of our research projects for digital design. And in the second half, we'll invite a really interesting panel of experts who have very diverse experience and backgrounds, and they will share their experiences and point of views on what does it mean like designing for privacy in today's context. And over the entire next 1 hour, if any of you have any questions, feel free to just type it in the Q&A option that you must be seeing on your screen, and we'll try to take up as many questions as possible during the panel discussion as well. So over to you, Avni, to present.
Thank you so much, Nikita. So in today's session on making it private, we'll be looking at digital behaviors and privacy perceptions of the Indian users from a cultural lens. As the conversations around privacy are gaining momentum and becoming the need of the hour, it is important to look closely into the gaps that have emerged because of the current formats of privacy communication and dissemination. But a precursor to solving for these gaps is understanding the nuanced needs and backgrounds and behaviors of the users, and also understanding how culture and history play a role here. This presentation will have 3 major parts. We will start by taking a glimpse into the history and culture of India, then proceed to understanding the digital landscape and its implications on privacy. And in the end, we look at ways in which service providers and global implementers can use these insights to improve the shortcomings of our current digital world, thus making it more inclusive and accessible. The reason that we want to start from the backdrop of Indian history and culture is because these factors define the physical world and also have implications beyond the lived experiences and also transcend to the digital space, which will help us make a sense of why that surround these user behaviors. Let us now take a quick glimpse into India. India is the 7th largest country in the world by area, but on the contrary, it ranks even higher, standing second in terms of the population. The statistic is fast changing, and India is set to overtake China to become the first largest country globally. This also shows that India has really high population density, and the availability of space per person in India is very limited as compared to some of the other countries. If we just compare to the US, for example, in terms of size, India is much smaller. US is 3 times the size of India, but it has only 1/4 the population. And hence the perception of personal space and privacy for somebody who has been born and brought up in the US is going to be very different as compared to India. Most Indians also live in densely populated areas, and even within the home, space is very limited, which leads to families having more shared spaces within the house. It is common in India for siblings to share rooms, or in some of the lower economic segments, only to have one bedroom in a family of 4 to 5 people. In our interviews with people, when we have asked them about what parts of the home do they like to spend their personal time in, we have heard participants quote spaces which are often outside the boundaries of their home. Like some participants have told us that I like to go to the terrace, or I like to go to the garden near my society. India is the oldest living civilization in the world today. It has a very rich historical and cultural heritage, ranging from the northernmost Himalayas to the southern peninsula, which is surrounded by oceans. India is home to kaleidoscopic diversity in terms of geography that reflects in the people, their food, clothing, language, as well as the traditions. India has also had a very long history of about 1200 years of facing continuous external threat and invasion. But the multicultural civilizational identity of India is still very strongly intact. And this gives us a glimpse of the resilient social fabric that is very much a part of the mindset of the people today. In the generations that have lived post the independence of India, amidst the backdrop of huge economic and social disparity, the country and its people had to really focus on building the foundations. The first generation that lived post-independence is that of our grandparents. So now for the 3 to 4 generations that have lived post-independence, the phases that they were in fundamentally were very different. And hence we see a big change in the focus and priorities for each generation, as it has moved from being more survival focused to gaining stability, and now moving from growth and beyond to more exploratory mindsets in the people today. Traditionally, India has always had very strong community-driven societies. Even with the rise of urban living and migration to the city, we see glimpses of this desire to be socially connected and wanting to be a part of a community shine through. An example of this is how in rural areas where there are more traditional ways of living still intact, there are socially significant areas like a centrally located tree that becomes a community space where people meet and come together. And it is a common sight in villages to see the older people meet there every single day. And what is even interesting, that even with the adoption of the city life, it is common to see older generation meet unfailingly every single day to spend significant moments of their day together. In almost every housing society, in a tier 1 city like Mumbai, we see that the senior citizens hang out every single day, meet to chit chat, and often even share conversations over tea. Now, these shared social moments end up becoming sources of validation and information sharing that also create an impact in the digital behaviors. And we'll see more on that as we move ahead. So now, moving from the social context to within families, the Indian culture has a deep reverence and respect for elders, which has led to a social fabric that is hierarchical and lands more control with older people. Traditionally, within families, the grandparents would garner more respect and control, which is then followed by parents and then the children. This feeling of gratitude and respect is so strongly formed that we see some interesting glimpses of this reflecting in people's actions and speech even today. So here are some really interesting examples that highlight the position of parents in our lives. And these pictures are some photos that I've clicked from my own neighborhood. The first picture that you see is of a house that is named Ai Vadlansa Ashirvad, or blessings from mother and father. The second picture of a car that has a sticker that says Ai, meaning mother. And the very famous Indian truck graphics that hail Ma ki Kripa, or translating to mother's grace. These behaviors around parents' position and respect and power have really interesting implications in the digital world as well, and we'll look more into that as we move ahead. Now, as the focus and priorities of generations are changing and progressing from survival towards growth, we see that families are becoming more open and accepting towards adopting modern technologies. This shift has resulted because of the dynamism of what each generation brings to the family unit. We see that the older generation brings the more traditional values that the younger seek, and the young, who are the early adopters of modern technology, provide the support and handholding that the older non-natives seek in their journey of enriching their lives with the advantages of modern technology. Let us now take a look at some of the breakout behaviors. So taking a look at the behaviors and influences on the younger generations of millennials and Gen Zs in India, we see some really interesting breakout behaviors like the Videshi millennials of India. Videshi in Hindi means foreigners, and hence foreign influenced Indian millennials showcase some really interesting behaviors of how they adopt these influences in their life. In a recent conversation with my friend, she was telling me about her daughter's friend circle of 10-year-olds discussing the theme for a birthday party. The enthusiastic young folks unanimously all chimed in about wanting a Korean theme for the party. On asking about what they knew about Korean food or Korean music, their enthusiasm to make ramen and discuss BTS songs left us so amused at how the influences and trends have changed. And hence, it is no surprise to see that India features in the top 20 countries globally, where K-pop is the most talked about on Twitter. But now we know that it is not just on Twitter and it is everywhere. These desires to expand and explore outwards are very interesting behavioral nuances in the young that are shaped by access to digitization and also in turn impact the way digital services are used today. And while there is significant rise of the global culture that expands outwards, we see a huge contrasting force that is now going back to the roots with the we Desi millennials. Desi in Hindi is a loose colloquial term for Indian, and hence we Desi signifies leaning towards more Indian preferences. There is a powerful movement that is moving towards Indic knowledge systems, Indic traditions, and adoptions of Indian culture. With an Indian regional cinema that showcased true Indian spirit, winning a global accolade like Oscars this year, it has become a huge confidence booster and push for the society and its people. In the digital space as well, the popularity of influencers who exhibit Indian culture and craft or share Indic knowledge is growing. This has led to the rise of content creators from tier 2 and tier 3 cities and increase in more local content in regional languages that is becoming more relatable for the people from this land. With all of these significant cultural and historical factors, let us now move towards the digital landscape of India and take a glimpse at the digital realities for Indians today. We look at how the physical transcends to the digital. There has been a major shift and progress in the digital landscape of India, and that has led to improved access and inclusion of the marginalized segments of the society. There are three main factors that have influenced this change. The first one is the low phone and internet costs that fueled penetration and improved accessibility significantly in the past few years. The second being the global pandemic, which lowered human interaction, thus propelling the adoption curve and reliance on digital services. And lastly, society as a whole has moved towards being more stable from being survival focused. This gives rise to more means and financial independence, which also reflects in the growing middle class with growing aspirations. And this digital revolution has led to a large population now getting digitized with the influx of novice internet users that offer an unparalleled opportunity for global companies. But as we continue to tap into this ever-growing market, it is important for us to understand that the nuances of these diverse users so that we are able to intentionally and appropriately build for them. A vast majority of the Indian users today consist of NIUs. Designing and solving for their unique needs and challenges has fueled huge growth of services that cater to them in innovative ways. Here are some of the unique traits that these users showcase. Due to the limited exposure to tech, they have very low tech comprehension and awareness. They may also be largely non-English speakers, so they might feel alienated with the English-first web interfaces. Therefore, we see that they also face challenges with typing and rely heavily on voice assist. They also prefer video over text-based content as it helps them engage and overcome their language barriers. It is important to understand how solving for these nuanced functional and tactical needs of Indian NIOs can end up including and solving for a larger demographic globally. For example, if we solve for the language barriers for the NIOs, we can make these products accessible to wider non-English speaking markets as well. Or designing for alternatives to typing for NIOs can help senior citizens or people with special abilities also engage with the products better. Companies are currently only focusing on solving for these more tactical demographics driven diversities like age, gender, language, etc. But our interactions with the Indian users reveal that beyond NPUs, there are even more nuances in user behaviors. Let's take a glimpse into the behavioral diversity at play in the digital space and how that has implications on the privacy. The first one is the family-oriented and shared social fabric, which reflects even in the digital mindsets of the user. Talking about digital devices, the concept of a family phone is very common in India. Post the pandemic, there has been a rise of personal devices, but the fluid forms of sharing haven't changed. What this means is that what this looks like is that parents are setting boundaries for their kids on their usage, or the tech savvy family members support with advanced tech to the other family members, or support with financial transactions, or even using each other's phone for specific purposes is very common here. Sharing behaviors also extend beyond family to the close circles of trust like friends or neighbors. A teen we spoke to gave us a glimpse of how she feels comfortable with sharing her things with her close friend and her mom, who are like advisors to her. They helped her set up her social media profiles so she feels comfortable sharing her passwords with them so that they can help her in case she lands in any trouble. And these sharing oriented digital behaviors lead to a one family attitude towards privacy. What this means is that there is a strong sense of wanting to keep things within the family or within close circles of trust. Indians also consider family matters as private matters, and hence open sharing within families is encouraged without an individual centered boundary. As privacy is not top of the mind in Indian families, shared behaviors like family members accessing each other's phone is not really considered as a privacy violation. Sentiments around sharing devices, accounts, and passwords are very mutually oriented. And hence, we hear user voices like a teen who says that my parents want the best for me. So it's okay if they check my phone because it's for my own good. And on the other hand, the teenager's mom tells us that my son takes my phone to change the settings. I don't change anything after that because I'm worried that I might end up doing something wrong. The next one is wider generational gaps that we saw are leading to reforms in family dynamics and parenting styles in the physical as well as the digital worlds. There is a strong desire now in people to be connected online and learn new things. In nuclear families, even though nuclear families are increasing, but even within joint families, there is a subtle shift in boundaries. And we see nuclear family like boundaries within the joint family constructs. Like we hear parents say that decisions around their kids' life are more of their responsibility and not really a shared family responsibility as it may have been more traditionally. Breakout behaviors also shine through as we see desires and needs for seeking a safe space. Social media often becomes the safe space for people where they are able to showcase their talents, thoughts, or showcase their identity that they cannot express very strongly in the physical world in the pursuit of trying to safeguard themselves from social judgment. The breakout behaviors in the digital space lead to some people feeling the tension with adhering to the conventional one family setup and boundaries. We see people trying to find their own workarounds to work within these family dynamics. On the one hand, we see parents are trying to educate themselves and learn new things to understand new perspectives and safeguard their kids without trying to overstep their boundaries, which sounds something like, these days, all the kids have access to phones really early, so we can't even say no to them. But we try to keep ourselves informed so that we can advise them on what is safe and unsafe. And on the other hand, we see the kids who in the interest of safeguarding their privacy, have told us about how they have more than one social media accounts, one that is for their friends and the other one that they like to call more family friendly. This shows us how people try to navigate their needs within the social constructs by altering their behaviors and trying not to be too radical or rebellious. Then the tight social fabric of the country has also shaped the user willingness, opinions, and decision-making in the digital world. Especially in the lower economic segments, we see that information gained from social circles is used as tried and tested proof that define usage patterns and decisions on a very personal level. As people connect and depend socially, personal experiences and scare stories are shared openly, and these stories perpetuate to forming the wider perceptions in the society. This leads to lower and shaky trust in companies' communication channels, but tighter, unwavering trust in a person's real experience and stories. These mental models of the Indian consumers are interestingly used to the benefit by some impact-driven organizations which are working towards inclusion of marginalized societies. A financial inclusion has used a hybrid model of online plus in-person for the dissemination of their service, and it has led to higher adoption and better experiences for its beneficiaries. One of the customers of this financial service who we spoke to shared how she chose to opt for the service only because of the representative who would come to her village. She says that he explained everything very properly, and hence she felt like she could trust the company. Overall, this goes to show that the trust as a factor propelled by a person's social circle plays a very important role for consumers in India. Hence, we see that for a lot of people, their perceptions around safety, privacy, and trust in digital services are driven and based off of societal perceptions that they are exposed to. As people share fear stories with each other, these become huge drivers for the society. Like the fraud stories that people hear from each other or via WhatsApp forwards really end up defining how they feel about a particular company or a platform. And because of this, the existing low trust in the system is aggravated, and the feeling of responsibility and accountability of safety on oneself is heightened. This is a very unique India behavior, which is unlike any other Western markets where onus is more strongly placed on systems and organizations. This onus on self mindset, coupled with the limited understanding of privacy policies in their current format and lower awareness of an individual's right, leads to the belief that being safe is my responsibility completely, and it pushes for a behavior that I have to alter my usage of a platform if I want to be safe. But we see some contrasting behaviors to this as well. Despite the high trust in closed social circles and low trust in systems, it is interesting to see how the opposite behaviors also emerge in India. We see how on the one hand, people have placed lower trust in organizations and systems, but we also see a large majority of users showcasing massive trust in bigger companies and brands. And this trust factor emerges from a belief that since the companies are big, they will not do anything wrong or create any harm to me on a personal level. It is also believed that the higher public visibility of the company compels them towards higher accountability and better standards, which results in collective trust from the people. Summarizing the presentation so far, we can conclude that the needs around digital experiences and privacy are very diverse, which end up making designing for privacy very complex. The current solutions around education and navigating online privacy do not address these nuanced needs in any way. And global companies resort to a universal approach when designing for privacy, which makes the services unrelatable for users from other diverse cultures and socioeconomic conditionings. Hence, we need companies and implementers to start looking at privacy implementation from a more nuanced and informed space. We have now seen how India behaves uniquely, and behind these unique behaviors, there are three major factors that define and affect how one interacts with the digital world and understands privacy. The first factor is awareness. There is a very large spectrum of awareness within Indian users, and it varies generationally as well as contextually. And the second factor is trust. The extent to which people trust themselves, each other, or tech companies varies a lot, and the level of trust defines who they seek help from, information, or advice from. This also defines who they expect to be held accountable for any privacy breaches or issues. And lastly, the third factor is social dependency. The trust and awareness levels of a person also affect the kind of personal boundary that they may have with regards to their privacy, and hence we see diversity and social dependency from one person to the other. Largely speaking, people in India actively seek support and dependency in various domains in their life. Being dependent is a way of coexisting here. How parents depend on the older siblings for support and supervision of the younger sibling, or how kids depend on the parents for financial support, or depending on someone for their expertise and knowledge, like career advice from a distant uncle or fashion advice from that close friend. All of these are very strong elements that differentiate Indian users. So let us now look at how we can decode the Indian uniqueness. We have mapped the unique Indian behaviors across this graph, where on the y-axis, we have the scale moving from more dependent towards independent. And on the x-axis, we have mapped the trust factor that ranges from more onus on self-driven to the more trust in companies. And on the background, we have circles of awareness, with highly aware being the digital natives and less aware of the late adopters being the NIOs. Currently, companies are focusing on the uniqueness of users just by looking at their digital awareness, and hence they are focusing on only one of the factors. But if we start to map other factors such as their dependency or where and how they place their trust, we will notice that there are differences even in the seemingly similar user buckets. So based on these three factors, we have identified these 5 distinct profiles. First are the activist natives. These would typically be users who are highly tech savvy and aware, like the young urban millennials. They are independent information seekers who know the micro and the macro aspects of tech, or may even be working in tech. They do not shy away from expressing their opinions and making decisions based on what they personally feel is the right thing to do. This leads to actions like they may choose to boycott products if they realize that the companies are being irresponsible or unethical. Then in the same spectrum of the digital natives, we have the complacent natives. These users will also be aware, but they will showcase some dependence on the validated sources of information coupled by their own search for information, which will shape their individual behaviors. And hence they land closer to the trust in companies spectrum where they will be more complacent towards how they show accountability. They are also more reactive than the activist natives, where they will prioritize convenience and be satisfied with a value exchange and might not necessarily take really strong actions, but do what seems easy and convenient to do in that moment. Then in the middle, we have the herd followers. Herd followers can be digital migrants like our parents, the boomers living in urban cities. They are users who will lie somewhere in the middle in terms of not being fully native to tech, but also not being the late adopters. And although they may have not grown up using tech, their ability to make informed decisions for themselves differentiate them from some of the other segments in the lower awareness. Then we have the underconfident vulnerables, who represent the marginalized communities with high social dependence, low tech awareness, and needing more physical touch points in their digital journeys. This profile can be imagined to be that of a woman from a rural village in India, where she comes with lower exposure to the outside world, and this lower exposure results to lower comprehension, and these define strong conservative traits like only using the phone for really limited usage, like only for calling or messaging, or only partially using it for watching YouTube videos, and nothing beyond that. So tasks like doing financial transactions or changing the phone settings, etc., are not explored at all by a user who will be a more underconfident vulnerable, and they would consider these to be completely off limits for themselves. Lastly, we have the digital slowpokes, who represent the NIOs who may only recently be introduced to a smartphone. They have a higher degree of trust on companies because they believe that companies that are well known may not do anything wrong to them on a personal level. They place their trust in companies because of their large user base, and they find comfort in those numbers. They may also be users from urban areas, but they will showcase low tech comprehension. These users are also more submissive in how they place their trust in companies, like what will they may sound like, what will the company do with my data, and I don't think it is going to be a threat in any way. And these would be the typical digital slowpokes. So based on this graph, it shows how the activist natives and the underconfident vulnerables showcase the same behavior of more onus on self, but it is important to understand that the drivers behind these behaviors are going to be very different. In the next slide here, we see a table in which we have done a deep dive of what these drivers for these user behaviors can look like. So seeing how dependent or independent the digital citizens are, how they carry onus on self when it comes to their privacy, or if and how they place trust in companies to share information or hold them accountable. And as we start to break down the current digital behaviors and mindsets for each of these 5 profiles, we start to notice the differences that create a huge impact on their experience, which will also help us figure out how we can address their needs. When we start to look beyond the current behaviors that we have mapped above, we start to think of what are the individual needs around privacy. And here we have broken down privacy into 2 areas. The first is education or awareness around privacy, and the second is privacy interaction or engagement that includes what users do to stay safe and safeguard their own privacy. This might seem like a lot right now, and I won't go into the details of this, but you can take a look at the slide when we share this presentation with you all. But the idea here is that when we break down user needs and intently look at how these needs are so starkly different because of the user behaviors, which are so distinct and unique. And for example, if we look at some of the gaps in the experience of privacy that exist today for these profiles, we see that the activist natives might need multiple ways to access information to form their own opinions, whereas the digital slowpokes might need a lot more contextual and direct understanding of what is a good practice versus a bad practice in their digital usage. For the slowpokes, the gaps may also be around building their digital confidence by providing reassurance so that they can continue to engage with products safely and responsibly, and they do not feel excluded due to their fears or lack of confidence. In the end, to summarize the conversation, we as builders, designers, and innovators can design for privacy better by opting for more in-depth approaches and not taking the most standard or convenient paths. This can be done first by identifying who your target users are and going beyond just their digital awareness and also taking into account their behaviors and unique needs. By understanding and mapping how do these users safeguard their privacy today, and how is it that the different and how diverse and different are they from each other. Then by understanding their socio-cultural backgrounds and social dependency to do tasks or seek information. And in the end, having a holistic understanding of their context, which will help us design relatable and inclusive experiences around privacy that include communication, education, as well as the controls. And together with all of this, going beyond focusing on privacy as just one touch point within the entire experience of the digital service, but thinking of it more as an embedded aspect within the entire experience and the implications of it through multiple channels. And with this intentional approach, we can all build a web that is truly inclusive and accessible and relatable for the diverse users. Thank you. We will now move to the panel discussion, where we will love to discuss some of these themes with our guest panelists as well. And thank you again for listening.
Thank you so much, Avni. This was super helpful and super nice to see so many insights collated together. So I'll just now quickly maybe move to inviting all the panelists. I think we have Shweta and Erin already joined. We'll just wait for Soumitra to join as well. Hi. Hi, Erin. Hi, Shweta. Hi, Soumitra. Thanks a lot to all three of you to join and taking out the time. It's been super nice, and we are very excited to have you because all three of you come from a very different experiences and very different backgrounds. So we are very excited to hear your thoughts. But before we begin, should we just do like a quick round of introduction? If three of you can just briefly tell you so the audience know a bit more about yourself. Yeah. Shweta, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Nikita. So very interesting presentation, Avni. Thank you for that. So I think this was a different context because I come in from the financial inclusion space, but thank you. So I'm a financial inclusion practitioner for over 19 years, and I work for a global not-for-profit in the financial inclusion space by the name of Axion, where I lead their customer capability building practice, which effectively means as we design financial products for low-income segments, I put on the hat and the lens of our low-income customers and see that we are looking to build these products to meet the needs of these customers, engage these customers, and ultimately build their capabilities along the way so that they use these products responsibly. That's about me. Lovely meeting all of you.
Thank you. Erin, would you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Nikita. And yeah, thank you for the fantastic presentation. I'm Erin Hackett. I'm a qualitative researcher and associate director at Stripe Partners, which is a research and innovation consultancy based in London, UK. And I've had the pleasure of working with Nikita and Svar as well on a few technology projects in India. And in terms of the topic today, I've been involved in several research projects related to digital privacy in a range of markets, including some EU countries, the US, Brazil, and India, largely for social media companies, and with a particular focus on teens and young people and how they navigate privacy in their households and with their families. So that's mainly the lens I'll be bringing today, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, sounds good. Soumitra, would you want to give your background?
Sure. Thank you, Team Xeno, for the wonderful presentation. Lots of learnings for me as well. So briefly about me, so I'm a designer, innovation consultant. I work in tech mostly. I've been with Salesforce, now I work for Microsoft. And specifically to, privacy and digital data protection, I'm currently looking at a partnership where we're building new solutions for India to, support companies to deploy products in this whole sphere of digital protection that's coming up from a regulatory perspective. So excited to hear all your thoughts and also put my 2 cents in.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have conversation because I've been the lucky one to ask the questions to all 3 of you. Cool. So I would like to maybe start with maybe Erin. Since the kind of presentation Avni also spoke about, where she talked about the relationship between the socio-cultural background or the family structures, for example, and how does that affect into the digital behaviors of a certain market. So since you also right now mentioned that you worked with teens and social media platforms across different markets and countries, based on your experience, how do you think such what stood out to you the most in terms of what kind of family structures or the social cultural background of maybe India or any other market that you want to talk about affects maybe some of the digital behaviors and digital decisions that people end up taking, maybe across different user segments as well?
Sure, yeah. So I think listening to the presentation, something that really struck me was the one family approach to privacy, that idea of phones in particular, but also passwords and accounts being quite commonly shared. And I think this feels quite particular to India. And there's a few differences with other markets that I can talk through. So the first one would be the device privacy. So in most of the other markets where I've conducted research, the phone is largely seen as a private device. And that's often in comparison to other devices in the household, so laptops or iPads. And so by default, people tend to kind of keep the most personal things on their phone and look to keep that private from other household members. And there's this sense from caregivers and parents that when you give your child a phone for the first time, in some ways you're letting go of control. So I remember speaking to a mother in Brazil who said that she wanted to give her teen a phone so that she could communicate with them, but she recognized in a phone you lose control. Like there's going to be some privacy there that means you don't know what's going on. A second difference to that kind of one family attitude to privacy that stood out to me is the dynamics between different generations. So as you mentioned, there's like strong family unit in India and real respect for elders as well. And I think kind of the authority and deference runs that way. I would say particularly in Brazil, we saw this real rupture between generations where massive social, cultural and political shifts between generations led to really different perspectives between the parents and the teens. And young people were really actively seeking privacy from their parents and other adults, and doing that similar to some of the teens you mentioned in India by having multiple accounts. There's a thing called a dish account, which is like a spam account, which is really common for Brazilian teens to have to get that privacy away from the elders. And so there isn't quite that sense of following the authority of the parents there. And then maybe just a third one, something that was really interesting in the US is this aspiration as a parent to be able to trust your teenager, and the sense that it's your job to help them become this independent, autonomous being. And there was this idea that in order to have a space for trust to be established, there needs to be some privacy. There needs to be some things that aren't shared. And I remember this dad we spoke to who had a 13-year-old daughter say that he didn't want to use the location tracking on her phone because then he wouldn't have any need to trust her. And instead they had this rule where he'd phone her, and if he phoned her, she had to pick up and, tell him where she was. And he liked that because it created this space for trust to be established. And he felt like that fitted in with his role as a parent to help her become kind of autonomous and make good decisions.
Yeah, I think
I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to see like how even parents and the teenagers' dynamics and how they safeguard each other's privacy, and the usage also changes across markets. And within India, I think we see many behaviors coexist at the same time. Also, like how Avni had also talked about. So with the same thread, I think it'll be interesting to hear, Shweta, your experience and your thoughts as well, but maybe specifically from the perspective of maybe designing for marginalized communities, because they show very different behaviors when it comes to digital products. So when we talk about designing for inclusion for maybe marginalized communities, what do you think are these very unique and important socio-cultural elements that they show, or the behaviors that they show, which we think that the companies are today either missing out on, or we think that needs to be, made a note of in some way or the other? Because their behavior is very different than an urban population's behavior in terms of digital products.
Thank you for that, Nikita. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And putting in this kind of financial lens, especially for low-income populations, I think what companies tend to do incorrectly, and I've seen that from my experiences, also just treat this kind of target segment as one homogeneous segment rather than really designing for their needs. And I saw even from Avani's presentation, it's not just where they are digitally. There's a lot of nuances behind that, as she showed on that grid, right? Also, increasingly for low-income populations, we are seeing a lot of social norms driving how a woman can access and use her smartphone. I think there's not enough done there. And in fact, we find a lot of financial service providers making the mistake of reinforcing these kind of social norms rather than addressing it or building the agency and confidence of these women to kind of transcend these norms. And finally, I think one other one we see is then we see a lot of these kind of providers just treating that there is just no one silver bullet to address a problem. And you need to have several different kind of approaches to address the problem. So I just wanted to talk about one example. I mean, I'm just back from a very deep qualitative study that we have done. And we did it in the right from the Bihar to Karnataka and down in the south. And there, when you look at these kind of low-income populations, we are seeing about 4 different type of archetypes. One kind of persona of women who just have feature phones and have no access to smartphones at all. And there, for that kind of segment, typically they only trust cash. They don't have access to there's no use case to use digital. And then you have these other 2 segments, one where the lady, the client has a feature phone, but has access to a smartphone. And the third prototype where they actually, the third persona where the persona has access and she uses her own smartphone. So I think there, really the trust levels matter a lot. So we find with persona 1, she just trusts cash, but increasingly persona 2 and 3, they're seeing these the small use cases in terms of using digital. So trust and this kind of strong use case is really what matters for this segment.
Yeah, I think it's very important also, like the things that you talked about, like how we end up sometimes reinforcing these social norms unknowingly. Also, it's quite deep rooted with where as a culture and the society we are coming from, irrespective of which country we are in. And which I think becomes for sure very important for companies to make a note of. So with that, I think it'll be really great to get, Soumitra, your perspective on, after your experience with like interacting with different user segments across different user industries as well. What do you think are, or like, how do you think these bigger companies are trying to look at this digital privacy or digital products beyond just it as a norm or just a functional need that gets added into the product, but looking at it more from, say, the user perspective, or understanding how are these users interpreting different digital platforms and privacies. So do you think, are there any such conversations already started, or it's still like a checkbox or a functional need that gets added into the design process?
Great question, right? And I think, look, I think the first thing I'd say is that when we're talking about privacy, what you're really changing is not just the products, but you're actually changing systems, right? So think about it. It's I draw a parallel to like sustainability, conversation around that. In the 80s is when we figured out, climate change was happening, it's real. It was a niche segment of the society that started, educating others. It's taken us maybe 40, 45 years to now bringing that as a regulation for ESG reporting. And there's still a long way ahead in terms of, what essentially everybody should be doing for sustainability. I think privacy is something like that, right? And it's going to follow a trend similarly. So I don't think it's just tech companies who have a role to play here. Every company today is a tech company. Like you take Microsoft, Salesforce, they sell their products and services to other companies, which eventually end up in retail stores, at airports, at immigration, and wherever you are, there is a tech footprint of some sort. So the idea that, yes, tech companies should be baking privacy into everything that they do, but it's also, every company should be doing that, right? And it's going to be led by consumption, because consumption really drives the economy, right? It's what people want that essentially gets built. And then when it goes out of proportion, just like sustainability, when fossil fuel usage goes out of proportion, that's when the regulators step in and say, hey, we want to so regulations give you scale. But as we know, it's really hard for companies to adopt regulations. Regulations for sustainability, ESG, have been around for years. It's only now, and the adoption is not that great. There's constantly, think about the plastic ban in India. So difficult to implement, right? So you have to come to a stage where people want it. People want sustainable products. People, that becomes a majority point of view or a value that's shared. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done in the awareness and the value enablement in a way, right? What worked for sustainability was a lot of these, you can see and experience global warming in many ways, climate change, right? So that's become real for so many people. I think we haven't reached that stage yet where privacy has become a problem or a challenge for people at large. I think the stories are still niche. People don't care. Yeah, you have my phone number. So what, right? So I think that's one. So I think we have to and there's a role here to be played. So, companies will come, we will find leaders, Patagonia for sustainability, for example, Apple with privacy. There is an opportunity for companies to step up and say, hey, we are going to be about privacy. And there's a role for designers to play in these companies to become leaders and bring this sensitivity to, every touch point, every customer engagement, or the way they, treat their data and so forth. So it's a complex problem. I heard a lot about complexity, multiple issues, inclusion as well. I'll give you an example of where's the opportunity, right? So in India specifically, privacy is a choice there are cases and scenarios where you want to invite other people in your life, right? Especially friends, family, and so forth. But there are a lot of scenarios where you actually want to keep people away, but they are forced into your life because of accessibility issues. Or if you go to a shop and then you have to deal with a shopkeeper to buy something and the shopkeeper knows what you're buying, right? So how do you kind of take that as modality? Is that, hey, there are scenarios where I want to invite people in my life and share my life with them. There are scenarios where I'm forced to do that. And how do you acknowledge that and design for that? I think if you're able to do that intentionally, I think you will find a fan following in the people who care about privacy. And that's going to build your tribe and position you as a leader. So I think there's an opportunity to be a leader. I don't think there's any company in India that's really leading or owning the privacy value. If you want to get there, I think this is the way to go. You need people to get sensitized to, what's happening in the world or in India, and then design for that. And that was long, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, but I think it's very valuable. Also, very interesting thing that you also spoke about is that how it needs to also become a need and not just a choice from the consumer side as well, for even to not like put all the responsibility only on these tech companies. But considering that they are in the position of influencing a lot of larger population, we also saw how digital payments suddenly took like steep curve in India after a lot of, I understand there were a lot of these infrastructural changes like demonetization and COVID and all of that pushed people for UPI. And then so many companies started innovating in that space, and then it got adopted quickly. So it went like hand in hand in a way, but it's great to see that it needs to be looked at as a broader ecosystem and not just like one solution that is going to solve, like how Shweta mentioned, like it's not going to be like one silver bullet to solve all the problems. So with the same thread, Samitra, talk about in terms of the data protection bill that is change the way companies are currently designing for the Indian population, or do you think, or in any way that will affect the users directly? In any way, maybe if you have any ideas or perspectives around the user side of it, like, and the effects on the.
So I couldn't hear you very well, but I think you're asking about the data protection bill, right? So
Yeah.
look, the bill has been in the works for a decade, right? And I think that just shows how complex that issue is. So many stakeholders and actors, and everybody wants the bill to work for them and so forth. So even the bill, it was proposed and drafted last year, but was taken away. And then there's probably going to be a Digital India Act, which is going to be like an all-encompassing thing. So look, I think from the bill itself, it gives you it. I guess there are many positive things there. It gives people the right to be forgotten, all the kind of thing. I think we're learning from GDPR and things like that as well. People are aware, they're expecting those kind of things in this bill as well. So definitely it's going to affect not only like consumers or users, but also like the way companies work with data, and they'll have to have new solutions and processes in place. And I think that's where I'm going, because it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to involve companies investing in all these reporting and other peripheral things, and that's going to slow down adoption potentially. And that's why I think that it's going to be a curve like the one you have had with sustainability and ESG reporting. Regulations will come, but I think it's going to take time for that to really be adopted and for us to see the difference, unless people become aware. And simply you're checking out at a store, and the next time they ask you for your phone number before you can buy a product, how many of us are actually saying, no, I don't want to give you my phone number, right? When that becomes a majority, I think that's when, like I said, consumption will lead regulation. Regulation will bring scale at once, like everybody fall in line. Yeah, sure. But for companies to be additionally motivated to look beyond the costs of compliance, there has to be a demand, and people have to demand those kind of values from companies. I think that's where we need to focus a lot more, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah. So, Erin, I would like to know from you and your perspectives also, since I think we spoke about a lot from the India market, but just based on your experience of working across different markets, do you think there is this gap between what maybe companies are trying to create and design versus the need and the user experience and user behaviors that we see? So do you think there is this gap that maybe need to be filled? Or are there any ways in which the companies are maybe falling short of understanding the experiences of the users and the needs of the users today? If you can think of if the gap exists in any way.
Sure. Certainly, I think we've seen similar things in Europe, as mentioned, with GDPR coming in, I think about 4 or 5 years ago now, and sort of seeing companies try and adapt to that. Largely, it feels like a lot of additional friction has entered into the user experience in terms of accepting cookies and reading long terms and conditions and signing your rights away to your data, that is in compliance with the regulation, but doesn't necessarily speak to the spirit of the regulation in terms of people having kind of informed consent and real control over their data. I think one reflection might be in terms of the user values and needs that from some research that we did a couple of years ago, we found that people's privacy needs and values are quite different. And we did a somewhat similar piece of work to you with segmentation, where we found these different profiles of people. And from the company perspective, I think it's important to figure out who your users are and understand which of those segments you're really catering more towards. And I think that comes down to some of these trade-offs. So are your users people whose primary concern is kind of convenience and efficiency, or perhaps control and visibility of what's happening with their data? Or maybe it's about getting something back from their data in return, so the benefit to them. And I think you can see different companies with different but successful privacy strategies. So for example, Signal, the messaging app, their whole selling point is that it's incredibly private. They don't track anything that you do. And so they don't collect your personal data, and that's why people use it. Whereas maybe an app like Facebook, it's about connecting customers with businesses, and getting personalized recommendations. That's something that people do value from the use of the app. And so the trade-off is a little bit different there. And there's this example as well of this very famous pub chain in the UK called Wetherspoons that decided to completely delete all of its emails from customers that it had collected over the year, because it realized that email marketing wasn't really necessary for a brand that was so well known and popular. And they used that as a kind of opportunity to become a privacy champion. As Sumitra was kind of saying, that sometimes there's a space for companies like Apple to step forward and use this as a differentiating factor. So for them, they realized that it wasn't really adding much value from the marketing side, and so they could use it to their benefit to kind of appeal to those who value privacy. So yeah, I think it's about companies figuring out who their users are, and what kind of privacy trade-offs they might be willing to make.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting also to see how it's happening in other markets as well, irrespective of the regulations being in place or not being in place. I know we have completed our 1 hour mark, but I just have one last question for Shweta. I hope all of you can just stay back for a little bit more. I would really like to understand also, like recently we came across the report that Axion had released by Center for Financial Inclusion, which was around the potential of privacy by design for the inclusive finance. So referring to that, I would also like to understand mainly your thoughts around the privacy by design framework that the report talks about, and also mainly from the perspective of the responsibilities that us as companies or as designers or researchers, all of us hold, or we need to keep it in mind while we are designing for the digital privacy.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nikita, for that. Center for Financial Inclusion is an independent think tank at Axion and conducts research and advocacy, and ultimately to develop solutions to create a more financially inclusive world. And this report particularly does look at different privacy by design approaches, and then identifies just gaps in these. So as Soumitra says, right, I mean, a lot of these are just compliance. Today, a lot of it is around compliance and not by design. So at least what I mean, some of the key takeaways that I find and similarities in my own work, I do see trust is absolutely the key, right? I mean, what came out from that report, and especially for low-income populations. And one key note that I really took home with me is just, especially for women, where, say, an online presence might translate to offline risks for her, especially in the how her data is used and images that are used of hers there. I also find that a lot of the providers that we work with, mainly financial service providers, they don't necessarily have the skills and the resources to really build and incorporate privacy by design. I think they're still very compliance focused where that is concerned. And I really like what Soumitra said was around privacy being a differentiator or a business model differentiator. Going back to that kind of research that we did, sponsored by HSBC, in the fourth prototype, I keep calling it prototype, the fourth persona of the lady we found are those who own their smartphones and they knew how to make digital payments. These, compared to the other three personas, we found are the ones, because they knew that they needed to make digital payments and they just can't stop making digital payments because there were trust issues or their money didn't return. They decided that they would just change provider. So if they went to one bank and they found that that bank wasn't servicing their need, they didn't have a good grievance redressal mechanism in place, or there were issues around their privacy, they would just move to another one. And then the whole community, as Avani also talked about, in low-income populations, they tend to emulate what their other community members have done. And so it's very likely that the whole community would switch, which is a very large risk for businesses working in these with these populations. So.
Great, thanks a lot. I think that report is definitely something we would also recommend to just refer to. It's very interesting work also to take a look at. Yeah, I think I would actually love to ask a lot more questions, but I understand it's quite late in India and also we have completed like the 1 hour. But thanks a lot, Erin, Shweta, and Soumitra, to join us for the short duration and giving your different perspectives and experiences. It's been definitely very enriching for me personally. And also thanks a lot, Avani, for taking all of us through the hard work that our team has been doing over a few years and consolidating that in like half an hour period. So thanks a lot. And thanks everyone who joined from different paths. What we will do after this is that we will try to send like a shorter version of the presentation to the people in the audience. So if you want to take a look or want to have conversations with us afterwards based on that, that will be also super nice. So we'll be in touch. And again, thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good rest of the week.